Okay, let's start. We've all faced challenges in emergencies, managing increasingly crowded responses, and particularly dynamic data information overload. In these situations, we have struggled to ensure that we provide operational and strategic decision makers with top-notch analysis at the right time and with the right focus. Today, Marcus Elten will introduce his three-point approach on how we can deal with this issue. Greetings from the United Nations, here in Geneva. The sun is shining. My name is Peter Muller. I will be your host for this first episode of UNDAC Talks. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I see we have almost 70 people from around the world, so welcome, and I hope you enjoy this. The UNDAC Talks is a new initiative by the Field Coordination Support Section of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA. With this lecture series, we aim to provide access to the extensive knowledge available within the UNDAC network and beyond to UNDAC members and our partners, so that we can maintain and reinforce the UNDAC system as a center of excellence in humanitarian action. So today's topic is something that we know will stick with you. It is something that many of us have encountered in emergencies in the first phase, yet a practical solution has not been explored in much detail. Today, Marcus Elten, I'm glad he's with us, will speak on how we can strengthen future UNDAC deployments to successfully manage an increasingly complex and crowded environment, as well as in terms of partners, as in terms of and responders, as in terms of data. Marcus is an assessment specialist in the Coordinated Assessment Support Section, CAS, of OCHA in Geneva. He started his career actually with the ICRC as a protection delegate in Rwanda, then joined later OCHA before also having been in Angola, I think, and worked with OCHA in New York on humanitarian policy matters before he joined us here in Geneva. Marcus is one of our go-to stars when it comes to coordinated assessment and situational analysis, and we always consider ourselves lucky to have him supporting us remotely in missions or in the fields, and of course in trainings and other methodology development workshops, etc. So Marcus will do the talk today. Please note that he will take questions after the lecture, so stay on for that. Marcus, welcome to UNDAC Talks, the premiere.
Hello, Peter. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me on this first UNDAC Talk ever.
Wow, exactly. Well, it's an honor for us to have you, actually. And it's always a pleasure to have you speak, because information overload is one of our biggest frustrations, obviously. And so your and your colleagues' approach to this problem is always very enlightening. Who would have thought that? Today we're going to talk about dealing with the crowded response and information overload, obviously very relevant for UNDAC. So let's hear your approach. How did this emerge, and how does it work for you?
Thanks, Peter. I remember sitting on a plane to Nepal just 2-3 days after the earthquake hit. I was being parachuted in as an UNDAC team member with the task to coordinate, to execute, plan and execute a multi-sectoral rapid assessment. And I remember sitting on the plane and thinking about the task ahead, and it emerged rather quickly that I've got a rather difficult task ahead. I looked at the shake map, which was really of the earthquake, which was really spread out and scattered over very rural areas, and I thought about the difficult terrain we had to cover and the many actors that were involved in this high visibility event, basically. And I already thought, being on the plane, it was I think the second or third day I got onto it, that already was a little bit behind the curve. So how could I pull this off in such a large emergency? Upon arrival, I remember, the plane had to park at the very end of the runway because the 2 or 3 slots at Kathmandu Airport were filled by other planes, and I had to schlep all these tablets like across the tarmac, I don't know, 3 kilometers to the terminal.
We gave them to you, right? I
had to bring them to you because of course it didn't happen. So I remember schlepping them to the terminal, doing all the check-in, coming to the arrival desk, and then I was on my way to the OSOC, or upon arrival, and I remember exactly, I was informed that a meeting had been called to discuss coordinated assessments within 2 hours of my arrival. So we're starting to slightly get a little bit nervous, to be honest. Yes. And I was also informed, by the way, the RCHC doesn't want any large-scale assessments, which later was nuanced, which actually what it meant was more assessments about delivery. And I was also informed that the government didn't want to hear anything about assessments because they were already being criticized for a slow response. And there were first reports trickling in from desperate people throwing stones at convoys that were just driving by. So really a very high-pressure, stressful situation as any other, of course, sudden onset emergency. So upon arrival, I was thinking, actually, it's not a difficult task. I've got kind of an impossible task ahead of me. So how can I add value? How could I add value amidst this frenzy, amidst all these partners running around and desperate people and a massive operation on the way? But luckily, I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. There was a good UNDAC team on the ground, and together with the team leader and his deputy and my colleagues from ACAPS, we quickly agreed that we should set up some kind of analysis cell to help us that would only dedicate itself to the coordination of assessments and analysis. It was a simple idea to bundle our capacities and divide our labor and to have a clear interface with all the other actors around us that would interact with us around analysis. And we could work closely with our other partners, such as MAP Action and our IAM colleagues. So with this, I had at least something I could go into this meeting. And I came up with a quick strategy how to manage this first coordination meeting, which I was sure was going to be rather hectic and crowded. So basically came up with a 5-point plan, more or less. Can't remember whether it was 5 or 5, but if I recall, it was these things mainly. It was explaining to all the partners that we're creating this interface, this assessment cell, that basically would look at secondary data and primary data. And that through this interface, our partners could engage as well. The second point was we're going to communicate that we would start immediately consolidating all this information and analyzing it. And the third point was I wanted to encourage the partners that they would share their information with us. So if they go out and do deliveries and come back with information, that will be shared with us. And then the other points were more about the assessment itself. I wanted to identify if there was partners willing to work on us on a joint assessment, and if not, if we at least could harmonize assessments. And then there was a fifth point in there, which I'm going to talk a little bit later about, was promoting a very simple direct observation form that we could already use to start collecting information. So with that, I had a little plan to go into the assessment. And of course, as expected, it was packed. The room was packed. I don't know, 50, 60 people. I had no idea who was who, except for those that were wearing the logo shirts. There was government in there. There were NGOs in there. There were these, I call them Humanitarian cowboys with the little drones in there. There was no space to sit. And that's how I basically went in straight from the plane. I can't remember. I think I was standing.
Okay.
So I went into this first coordination meeting on day 3, maybe day 4. I'm a bit blurry on that. So I went in and explained all those points. And there was a lot of talk, and everyone was already doing stuff, and some people didn't have the patience to wait. And at the end, I wasn't sure what I had achieved after that hour or so. But we did agree on 2 things. we managed to share a simple email of that cell with everyone and ask them to please share everything they have once they go out. So we will see how that would work or not. And the other thing I knew, at least, I got out of it was we would have a follow-up meeting with those that were interested in the joint assessment. So we had these two things going on. So stepping out that meeting, that's basically when I felt I finally landed in the emergency and now would go full on. And I remember ACAPS went off immediately to look and identify some volunteers and train them up and start their secondary data analysis work. And I went to the OSOC and we set up our tent. And for those that can see the screen, our tent was that black tent right in the middle. Let's see if you see my cursor right here. That's where we set up our assessment analysis cell. And next to it was the reception desk and our map action colleagues were there. So on the other side we have the colleagues from the EMT, the medical teams, and IM was hidden here behind a tree. And so there was a physical space for us, and we immediately put tables in there, and throughout the day ACAS came with more and more young, smart volunteers, some of them locals, to start and set them on tracking social media, local media, etc. So we started our work from day one. While we were still trying to figure out our assessment approach, we could already start crunching the information that came in. And to my delight, the sharing of the simple idea of sharing our email address actually resulted in the following days of the Red Cross sending us stuff, and other partners sending us stuff. So a lot of information was coming in we could start working with. So we started looking at what are the most affected areas, breaking that shake map down and understand what were the most affected areas. We worked in districts starting with the worst, worked our way down. We started, with the help of a local UNDP guy, mapping out the assessment coverage. Every time someone told us we're going to do assessment there, we put that on a map so we could start building, sort of putting the puzzle together. We engaged in estimating the people, because in Nepal, particularly, it was difficult. We had a quick idea of who was affected, but it was much more difficult who would be actually in dire need of assistance. So we started working on that. And in the meantime, so we had one team focusing on that. In the meantime, I concentrate on the assessment bit, pulling together maybe Mira, or pulling together at least ensuring that there's some kind of harmonization across. So we produced these maps, the severity maps of districts. We tried every day to basically produce something. A few examples. And we organized daily briefings that were open to everyone. And we had, I remember the Canadian military come in, some donors come in, other militaries actually sit down and share information. We would share our analysis, and we would also use that during the day. And we would try to plug into the larger coordination meetings and feed in to those meetings as much as possible. So we were setting up this machine that was running.
Great. But it sounds like a quite typical environment, right? Where you have a lot of actors already on the ground and coming into the country, probably going off in all directions is what I recall, or at least initially Kathmandu, but then quickly looking beyond that. You have a government that is under pressure, you have a resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator under pressure to produce something quickly. You already mentioned directions coming very, very quickly while you were still on the plane. At the same time, trying to understand the situation. So I understand that your first step was to really bring a group of people together to deal with it, UNDAC, partners, volunteers, etc., and have them collaborate with a focus on analysis. So I think that was a good practice, or was an example of a good practice. So let me already ask you a question. Do you see a need for UNDAC and the OSOC as a concept, but also as a physical coordination platform, to invest more in analysis and the analysis that we produce and the decision making support capacity, turning this kind of assessment and analysis cell into really an intelligence tent or intelligence cell of the OSOC? Can you tell more about that?
I do, Peter. I do think we have to invest more in this, absolutely. imagine future UNDAC deployments where a dedicated and incapacitated cell is standard. Where a platform that tries to capture all the information that goes through the OCHA and around it is being captured. That will be the norm. The analysis cell is a simple concept. At a minimum, the cell needs to be equipped with 2 people. So that's the minimum setup. One person focusing on the secondary data on the analysis, and the other person running around trying to coordinate all the primary data, the field assessments. In Nepal, we were lucky that we had 2 excellent ACAPS guys with us who were leading on the secondary data side. And that they were able to train up these young people to help with the tracking and consolidation of information. But also the cell is not on its own. It needs to be set up so it can closely integrate with all the other functions. In Nepal, again, we have map action right next to us. The IAM's not far. We have EMTs next to us. So that was a good, even if it's a physical solution, it was a good solution to start working together. And recognizing that the load of work on this assessment is not just about the cell, it's about all the functions. I would like to see how, I would have to think about how then the functions can work tighter together to get a handle on those information cells and developing the shared understanding. And it has to go further, I think, than what we've been doing so far. So in Nepal, I remember my colleagues from Civil and EMT, even very forthcoming. They would forward us emails. They will come and update us orally. There was an exchange. We struggled, however, on our side to absorb all that. That quickly became an additional flow that, well, how can we absorb all that and make sense of it and feed it back into the decision making? And I think this is not about just the cell alone. It's about the cells also thinking about how then can they contribute to developing this shared understanding and in what form. So rather than sending us forwarding just emails that might contain some information on the situation, think about what's the bigger picture. Yeah. So, I mean, the EMT cell, for example, and I'm sure they're working on it one way or the other, is that they also think about their assessment coverage map, or the who does what, or that when they are engaging with the Ministry of Health, to understand which health facilities have been, affected, put that on a map, and feed that us to us so we can start putting the picture together. The Signal guys, I'm sure, they might have access to a lot of good information that we humanitarians won't be able to get that quickly. Going back to the cowboys with the drones, that's maybe good for technical sort of operational support, but what we really need, if we want to work with that, is long-range drones, which we don't have the money for, and certainly probably wouldn't have the legal basis to fly them around, but the military might have it, and they might be willing, with limitations, to work with us and share that information. So making those connections. And the UNDAC guys, who also have been starting going mobile with using COBOL and mobile data collection platform, but they also think about when they're doing their assessment of the working areas and building over a map, that they feed that to us, and then we can feed it further up, so it can share it with the governments, with the donors, etc., so that we come all tighter together. And none of this is rocket science. I think the challenge is more that this requires rather a tight management, probably within the OCHA, in a high pressure environment. But yeah, it's not. We're not talking very technical stuff. It's really bringing it together.
Yeah, I guess it's bringing, as you say, it's bringing that together. But so, how many people does it require to do that? Because you have all those partners that are all collecting information in some technical area, but then you also have people that need to bring that together, which is basically your team then, or the OCHA team that does it. So, in a complex environment like that, or in Nepal, how many people did you have? But also in maybe less visible emergencies or smaller emergencies, how do you see that function being undertaken?
So in Nepal, we were fortunate. I acknowledge that. We had 2 ACAPS professionals We had, after a week, we had even, including myself, 2 CAS people on the ground, and then we had also supporting guys, which you don't actually have to count to, the assessors, so the map actually had, etc. So that's already a full professional setup. Plus, we had all those volunteers. Sometimes we forget that there's more capacity right in front of us in Kathmandu. We were fortunate to be, in this case, in the capital, and there were a lot of smart young kids, some from, I remember the IBM labs, some from universities, well educated, very, you know, technical savvy, communication technical savvy, and they were recruited and trained up, and we could use them. So we had at times 7 or even more people sitting in the tent, clicking away. So that is a lot of people.
There's a lot of capacity, but you will not always have that, right? You'll be in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So how do you go about that?
I mean, indeed, totally agree. So for this scale of emergency, I would argue that's what was needed. And I remember actually, while this is a comparatively large setup, I remember we quickly ran into problems when we started setting up the hubs. And I don't feel we supported them sufficiently consistently at hubs. And I think if we had started even supporting those hubs, we would have needed more capacity, and I don't think we managed to do that. So the hubs were at times a little bit left alone, particularly in the beginning. So if you think about then, if you start going into the hubs and proliferating, then the capacity really becomes big. However, so 2 things. I think we have to acknowledge, although we live in an era where there are fast advances in information technology, you still need people to absorb, to understand, to pore over the data, to make sense of it, and inform decision making. We can't just pull that away. It's not going to happen. But the concept of analysis and assessment can also be adapted to a mid-level emergency, the L2s, right? Again, I think it starts with assigning a dedicated capacity. And I know often in small teams, everyone has to do a lot of tasks, and it's not an easy thing as a team leader to say, okay, you're only going to do that. But if that person has to do also coordination liaison, it probably won't happen. It has to be a dedicated capacity. And I would argue for even for mid-range, mid-level emergencies, that a minimum setup of 2 people. Somebody you can shelter, you can shelter from all the business, and that concentrates on the analysis and bring it together. I can maybe task them, the other guy, to go and search for more information, but the other guy is dealing with the coordination of the field assessment itself. A mirror, for example, the mirror takes place. So I think that's the minimum setup. So it's basically about that dedicated capacity, and then yes, it's not something you can do over 10%. But then again, let's not forget, we're not operating in a vacuum. Unless you're really out rural, you probably have around you a lot of young people that you might not be able to pay, but that are willing to engage, particularly on the secondary data side, on this work. So we think about roping them in as we did in Nepal. We can boost capacity. And then there's also remote capacity, which we'll talk a bit later about. There's also remote support that can really boost such a cell. But my point is that if I look at observing some of the last missions, and also successful missions in assessments like the Peru one, the assessment concept of dedicated capacity still tends to be, I would argue, a bit of an afterthought. Oh, we have to do it, we have to do the assessment, and so we try to squeeze it in. I think that has to shift.
Right.
And last point, I also have to experience that a lot of colleagues feel this is very complicated work, technical work, you need to be an expert. Well, I would say maybe the assessment bit has some technical elements, but the analysis bit, no. We're all good, experienced people that can apply our analysis to it. And I've seen those that have started engaging in it actually started to like that work. And then you drive that process. So it's not always this cast person as the time sheet. But I think, yeah, there's still a bit of way to go, but we can go there. Yeah.
A bit of demystifying. Now you mentioned smart kids and that you can pick up the street. I'm exaggerating, but you also mentioned remote support.
Yes.
And I think we did something like that in Haiti. And maybe some other...
Yes.
Maybe talk a bit about that, because you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah. It's in a few years that I've done a lot of good work happening now, coordinating remotely, a remote tune emergency analysis. The most recent example is Haiti. But before that, there was also the Ebola response and a few others. So what happened in Haiti is, I remember when the Hurricane Matthew started to be north. We had a small team dispatched to Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti. You know, 4 or 5 people, very small team. But then suddenly it became clear that this Hurricane Matthew was actually veering a little bit east and was going straight for the western tip of Haiti. When we understood that it was going to hit that, it became clear that this is probably a bigger event than this would become a big event. So we very quickly, within CAS and our colleagues from the IAM section and the Digital Humanitarian Network, for those that I don't know, we decided to activate this remote joint analysis group. And for those who haven't heard of this before, it's actually also quite a simple idea. We basically started to moderate a Skype group where we were asking people what they were working on, what kind of information they had, what they needed. And this Skype group, we added then, rather organically, more and more partners that we knew were working on specific angles, and it grew within 2 or 3 days to 45 person, representing like 22 organizations. Not all of them same active, but among them at least 10 very active. Included guys from UNICEF, the Pacific Disaster Center, Center for Disease Control, REACH, ACAPS, Translators Without Borders, Statisticians Without Borders, the Red Cross, and OCHA, etc. A lot of people working on their outputs and their maps and their analysis. And we basically, the idea was that we bring those together and see what we can do remotely, right? So what we did is we started looking at who's working on what, and we started to using basically a Google sheet, which I acknowledge on this screen looks now very cramped, but basically what we did is we took this Skype conversation and started summarizing the discussions and the main outputs and putting names behind it and links so people could see what was happening, who was working on what. And we also used a platform called Trello, which you see here. Basically what it did is we have 3 columns and some instructions. Here we would list what information we were looking for, what was being searched on, and what had already been identified. So that would allow people to understand who's working on what, and if you particularly, you were, for example, planning a deployment or doing some analysis, and you were interested in understanding the populations in the affected areas or looking for a map of water points, well then you at least would know that this is being worked on and or maybe even available. All this information was then posted on HDX, Humanitarian Data Exchange. So, free tools, and basically the point here is a lot of sort of analysis coordination we could then also do remotely, while the team was hunkering down in Port-au-Prince while the hurricane passed. And just to make the point why this is worth it, for example, within 2 days we could establish basically which areas were most affected by overlaying that corridor of where wind speeds were higher than 120 kilometers, and the population living under it. And we could quickly establish which area was most affected, assuming that the main vector of destruction was wind speed. Which it turned out it wasn't precipitation, it was more wind speed. And then an area assessment that the UNDAC team did a week after touchdown confirmed basically this line of where this corridor went through. So our initial estimates of how many people were affected, and then you dig deep in analysis to understand who needs assistance, were quite accurate without having to be in the tent or in land cruise.
Okay. So what were then the main challenges? Because it sort of, you say, okay, so we had that under control.
Yeah, I would say one of the challenges was then the link to the field. So this work, and I also saw that
the field in Germany or in Port-au-Prince.
So let's say without even going to that level, the link to the UNDAC team and to the operations, right? So we doing this work remotely, we had contact with our colleagues in the OCHA office, but they're also overwhelmed with a lot of other work. So that link only became stronger once we set up an assessment cell in Haiti. And we only could do that as, it was a week after touchdown, and we had again our ACAPS colleagues that were surging in, and they set up a mini cell with colleagues, I think the Red Cross was in there, and a few others. And then we had that link. Then we had somebody who could say, I need this, or give us directions. And then we had somebody also to push our outputs down. And that link, is so important, because you can quickly just spin around yourself. Mass being produced that maybe the team on the ground would have liked to have at their fingertips before they walk into the coordination meeting of the government. But all making those connections, that only happens if we're tight and that link is strong. And I think it's something we have to work on.
So could or should UNDAC members engage in this kind of work?
Certainly. I think there's a lot of potential for off-site support from UNDAC members. Particularly for those that might be not able to go on a mission, which of course is what most people prefer, but maybe the work doesn't allow, but they will still want to engage. Well, there's, I would say, an opportunity. The challenge is there for me to be very clear of the skills, availability, and what's required, what we're working on. If we can set up a clear tasking, and somebody can come in and say, I'm good in this and that, again, that's a lot of management work, but that can be done remotely. I think there's a lot of potential that we could explore. Well,
that's good, because of course we're thinking about new practices and profiles and how to remain relevant as UNDAC in the changing environment. So that's a very good point. We'll be working on that. Your final note, maybe, Marcus. You were also going to say something about innovative tools.
Right.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
So there's a few fun things we are tinkering around with. And one of the things we're thinking about here in CAS is acknowledging that it's an increasingly complex working environment, a frenzy of actors out there. So how can we go back a little bit to the simpler? And one of the tools we're playing around with is, again, a simple idea. It's what I refer to as a super simple direct observation form. And the idea is that we have something so minimalistic in terms of assessment form that any responder, bilateral responder going in, can download via CORBA. This is an artificial view of a CORBA application. Is to download a simple form that's purely based on direct observation. It has been tested in a few areas, also by other partners. It's not like this is a very new idea, but I think we still have to implement it.
Is this what the USAR guys already doing?
That's an early version. This is a nice visual one, but we've gone away from the visuals. The main point is that we have a form that doesn't take more than 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. And what we're working on now is, and basically you put a link on Virtual so everybody can download it. And this form will look at 5 things. It would look at the level of destruction in an area, look at the severity. It would look at if any displacement observed in that area, and if yes, there will be a few follow-up questions of shelter type, how many people they estimate. And the third one is there any response observed in that area? And if yes, then we will break a little bit more down about who are the responders, the military organizations, and by which sector. There's one thing also, market functioning, and then it will conclude on, after all these observations, in the mind of the enumerator, what would be the most 3 top needs. And this should help, in a way, crowdsource direct observations. Because we, in the UNDAC team also, I think we're very good at observations, but we suck at collecting them systematically, reporting them back, and using them. It's all anecdotal or in word.
It is a general problem, right?
I would say.
Yeah. And okay, maybe there'll be some questions, I'm sure, about it later. But any challenges that are still with that with these tools?
Yeah, of course. I mean, idea is simple, and I think the simplicity makes it potentially powerful.
Because I like that, what you said, demystifying simplicity, but there's always a catch. No?
Of course. Well, the crux lies in the application of the form and in interpretation of the data. One thing is, every observation, maybe a level of destructive severity will be interpreted differently, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be very clear on how you classify those levels of severity. Also, I think a challenge is that partners might download the form but they're not using it. If we get 10 or 20 observations, points, that's not very helpful. Mm-hmm. But if actually people think about it in their response and use it, and you can start collecting 60, 80, 200, 300 data points, you can start mapping that stuff. Because they're all geolocated. This is an example of Fiji. So all these recordings are geolocated, and you can start quickly mapping it with the limitation, observation, direct observation, so you have to be careful in your analysis. But it bridges that gap between the secondary data analysis and actually organizing a more meaningful key informant mirror type assessment. So there are challenges, but I think if we start introducing this, and actually get more, start using it, we maybe integrate our trains, we can start making our lives in that initial crunch time a little bit easier, by at least starting to collect more systematically that data. Yeah.
Great. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, Marcus, about this. It's fascinating. So thanks for sharing that. Before we open the discussion, because we have to move on, maybe some last pieces of advice, gold nuggets here.
Sure. So there are a few things. I think no single tool or method can answer all questions in this day and age. Everyone has their own tools, everyone is excited about them, and no single tool can actually do it. I think the key lies to collaborating in the analysis and combining tools and everything, and this is what the assessment cell can do. I think the idea of to parachute into an emergency and pull off an assessment like that is something incredibly difficult. So how can we hedge that? Well, we can hedge that by setting up the internal structures right, looking for support, etc. And it's not like in the good old days where somebody's waiting for us to land, jump in a Land Cruiser, drive around, and come back with our findings. Those days are over, I would argue. Those days are really over. Nobody's waiting for us to tell, oh, I've seen this, I've seen that. So our job is more to bring together all these bits and pieces, making sense of an initial chaotic picture into something that we can structure, maybe more thinking in terms of networks. We have our OCHA assessment cell, we have our government counterparts, we have remote analysis, and our partners doing work. How can we bring this all together and analyze in a way that we can actually support decision making, enhance the shared understanding? And the final point is, of course, also a lot of success of this lies in preparedness. So the work we have to do. In Peru, I was quite excited to see that we did a very good job with assessments, and that was mainly possible because of preparedness. Right. And so people knew what we were talking about, they were ready to go, they worked together, and they produced results. Of course, we have to always tweak and improve, but that's sort of the key. Great.
Okay, now I'm sure that people that are listening and watching find this very helpful. So what I'd like to do now is move into a bit of a Q&A with the people that are online. So I'm going to be a little bit dependent on our assistants here who will open the microphone. So we have some questions, I think. I think the first one is from Lucien Jaggi, who also works for OCHA. Maybe, Lucien, if you can be on speaker, introduce yourself in 2 seconds and ask your question. Let's see if we get sound here.
Do we have to unmute? Or not?
No. We should be mute. Otherwise, do we need to look at the chat or not?
Here's the chat.
We'll go to the next question, which comes from Miguel Moronta. Miguel, unmute, quickly introduce yourself and ask your question, please. And thanks for watching.
Hello, it's nice to see you. My name is Miguel Moronta. I'm from
I'm not
wait, we need to put our mic on.
Okay.
Miguel, just bear with us. The audio is really weak. Can we maybe boost this up?
Can you hear me now?
Can we put this on speaker?
Hello?
Miguel, just bear with us. We're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Hello.
Okay. Repeat that, please, Miguel.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Miguel Moronta, and I come from Dominican Republic. I'm an UNDAC member. I have the next question regarding the mission in Nepal. When volunteers started working on secondary data, what were they looking for? What were the key elements that they were searching for? What was the most difficult data to fetch?
Hola, Miguel. Nice to hear you. So what were they looking for? Sorry, Miguel, shall I take a few questions, or how do you want to run it? Yeah, okay. Miguel, what were they looking for? I remember that ACAS divided up kind of what they were looking at. We had guys looking at social media, we had local guys looking at local media, but somebody going through all the humanitarian outputs, the SID and updates. We had somebody else scraping the international media. So they're all put to task to go through that. I think we had even 2 people looking at the local media that could speak Nepali, and we were going through that and tagging each piece of information, cut and pasting into a table, and tagging them with certain criteria so afterwards we could sort them. I would say that the most difficult information is always a better understanding of the situation. We always get quickly information on who's doing what, who's delivering what, who's planning to do what from the organization, for understanding how many people, what their needs are. That tends to be still a bit of a challenge.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Then I think from Bangkok we have John Marinos. John, are you in Bangkok or are you on holiday still in Greece?
Both, actually. Back from Greece, but it is in Bangkok. But when your head of forwards you the invite to this UNDAC talk, you take that as a signal that you better dial in, even if you're on vacation. So here I am. I guess I have more of a comment than a question. I was fortunate enough to work with Marcus on both the Nepal response and the Fiji response that he referenced. You know, in Nepal, we could talk about for a very long time because I think so many best practices came out of that response, and in many ways, it's shaped how we think about response and preparedness in throughout Asia, at least from the regional office perspective. But what freaks me out about Nepal is that I know a lot of people, there was a lot of capacity, right? I mean, that tent seemed to have like 12 people in it at any given time. And also it was the assessment dream team, right? I mean, you had Marcus doing coordination, you had Patrice doing analysis, Nick and Bowden was there, everything. So I think it would be hard to recreate. But my experience in Fiji, I think was I mean, it makes me sleep a little easier at night because it was a much smaller emergency, but you know, it was a small team was able to use sort of analysis to come up with this picture in the first 24, 48 hours based on secondary data, and then the UNDAC team was there to sort of test those assumptions. So based on the storm track and what we heard, you know, we made some rough assumptions about the impact of that storm, but the UNDAC team was able to deploy to the field, and they were the first one, by the way, going out to the affected areas, and they used an assessment form very similar to what Marcus showed on the screen, and what Marcus himself developed at the time, and it was really helpful at if nothing else, proving or disproving the assumptions we made in our very, very initial analysis. And I think that's a very good role for UNDAC to play, being on the ground first. I mean, you know, if we look at it from this regional dimension, you know, being uniquely suited to go out into the field. You know, when you're in Fiji and you have an UNDAC team with Pacific Islanders, this is good, right? So I mean, I think there's a lot to learn from Fiji, and I'm sure many other places. But I mean, my experience in Fiji was very positive, with UNDAC playing like a role that was really perfect for them, and that was really helpful for the response. Over.
Thanks, John. We very much there. Yes, there's I think a lot of good stuff we can pull from the Fiji and similar experiences. Encouraging stuff. Yeah.
Maybe we'll go to the fourth question. Daunia Pavone. Yeah, Daunia Pavone. Unmute yourself and introduce yourself briefly and ask the question. Daunia. We can't hear you. Yep.
Briefly.
Yeah. Daniel, go ahead. We hear you typing, I think. And we hear a bird.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Daniel.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, I had a couple of questions actually.
Introduce yourself,
the first,
Daunia.
Yeah, sorry, yes. My name is Daunia Pavone. I currently work for IOM, the DTM team in Geneva. And I was particularly interested in what you were saying about the remote, or the digital volunteer role in some of the recent emergencies. My question was if you in UNDAC or in OCHA are working in any way to kind of make the whole approach a bit more predictable. What I'm thinking is, you know, the platforms that you were mentioning, are they the best suited? Have we actually found that these platforms are the ones that we're going to use? Is every organization aware that these are the platforms we're going to use for data scramble, data, or kind of sharing data? So is there any preparation you're doing in peacetime for that, so that the next, you know, sudden onset, we know where to go, we know what is going to be set up? And then I guess the other linked question was, I was with OCHA in Libya in 2011. And one of my tasks was to work with a group of remote volunteer support. And it was really challenging because what it needed was a lot of management. And we didn't have the time to do that in the team. So is there any kind of initiative around identifying resources that during an emergency can do the management of these large and dispersed teams?
Sorry, you said Libya 2011?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Tonya, for these are good questions. Yes, we are working on improving that. Together with Digital Network and our IOM colleagues, we had earlier this year on the Partnerships Week in Geneva, we presented sort of the experience, the lessons learned, the current practice. So based on that, we have developed a few principles of collaboration, rather than SOPs, because it's still a rather organic, voluntary collaboration. And on the platforms, to be honest, how we got to these platforms is that the choice for those platforms were who was the most familiar and the free ones. That's how we ended up using Skype, Google Doc, etc. And every time we do talk about this, people say, yeah, but Slack is better, or other platforms are better. For us, it's the main criteria now is what is everyone most familiar to use, and can we manage with that? Can we manage with those platforms the information that's coming through? And so far, those have us served well. We might be moving in the future to Slack, which I understand is more powerful. Probably have to have a dedicated discussion with specific people who are interested in that to maybe advance on that. Right now, it's true, it's rather loose. We have principles of collaboration, which we still have to share with the community as a follow-up to the Network Week. And what we also planning to do is at least to create sort of, but we have to be careful also, have already a pool of people that we know we can contact without going too wide, so we can quickly trigger these collaborations. You're right. There's no solution yet to all of this. Which of them will we activate or not? I mean, this morning after the Philippine alert came up, I spent the first hour looking at scope and scale, thinking in mind, okay, are we going to activate such collaboration, yes or not? I'm hopeful that we've been lucky in the Philippine event. That doesn't warrant an international remote coordination, but we haven't established triggers as such. It really depends a little bit scope and scale, and also a little bit the area. If it's a non-English speaking area, there might be less people available for it. So it's a bit of a testing and trying. But you're right, we still owe, in follow-up to the network, network week a little bit more of a structure. I want to share those principles. There's still work to do, and hopefully get it done over the summer.
Over the summer?
After my holiday.
Good. That's a good question, though. We have a question from Joe Kaiser, or we'll go first to Lucia. Lucia, why don't you try? You're online now. Now your microphone is really bad.
You have to come near to the mic, please.
Yes. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
I'll just shout. I think that slide actually is quite relevant to what I was going to ask you. Is that you mentioned those different networks and the role that you play in coordinating and bringing all this information together for spread a sort of situation awareness and common operational picture. How do the actors that are not part of those discussions of the digital network and maybe local actors actually and the government contribute to this, and how you make sure that they are aware of those discussions that you have and this coordination that you have sometime remotely, from Geneva or the virtual networks?
Yeah. Good point, Lucia. Two things. I think to initiate such a collaboration coordination, my experience is always most effective to start with your few champions. Those that are most willing to engage, that know how to engage to get the work going. That's where you produce, particularly in those first 72 hours, the most outputs. And then in a second step, you want to think how you can enhance or dig into analysis, and that's where then you want to, of course, reach out to local partners. But I would argue there's no standard guidance that we can develop here in Geneva that would inform us. It's very much an organic process. It depends on our contacts. And much of it really just happens on the go. I think important here is, as you mentioned, that we think about it, we try to reach out and bring those people in. We've seen I would argue in Nepal, but also recently in Peru, if of course you have people that know the local context, your analysis is always going to be more rich, and assumptions you might make can be challenged from people that know the context. That always is going to result in a better analysis. But so my point is, I would argue, start your work with your champions. You have to exclude what's noise at the beginning because it's overwhelming, and noise could be organizations that do not contribute or do their own thing or don't know how to engage, and then only after at least you've got a little bit on the handle on the analysis, on how you set up, then you reach out to sort of more the local partners. With government, I think also has to be seen on case by case, how you want to involve the government. I remember in Nepal, and others were there as well, how we had very good collaborative counterparts from the government, and then I remember one of our colleagues went to visit their sort of analysis cell, or their setup where they were trying to collect information, and there was literally a room with printed papers and lots of telephones, and then trying to get how everything that comes in, and they were also overwhelmed with their side. So we have to really approach it case by case and how to best engage. I don't have a blueprint recipe for that.
Okay. But good point, though. Yeah, interesting. Okay, we are almost an hour gone, so we're gonna take one more question. Joe Kaiser, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Copy.
Okay, great. Yeah, I worked most recently with MEDAIR and responded to both Nepal and Haiti. And one of the larger frustrations we had from the NGO community with the assessment process was the involvement of the government and when an assessment or when data became official, if we can put it that way. And it caused a lot of frustration, a lot of anxiety, and then a lot of delays. Is there any lessons learned or new thinking on how we can anticipate or how we can prepare for that kind of environment, that kind of political environment in the next disaster?
I think it's describing quite a common challenge, right, in UNDAC deployment. And particularly in Haiti, I remember that good work was done and then the government sat on the data either because they weren't able to process or didn't have the time or they weren't willing. That happens also in other missions. From the analysis side, I like to distinguish the work we do around analysis in order to understand a situation and that information that circulates rather freely and quickly through, for example, this collaboration space via Skype, and to what's public, officially communicated findings, which the government might want to have a clearance on it or a rubber stamp on it. I try to treat this a little bit different. What product goes out with, for example, a UN logo or a government logo on, it goes through a slower process of clearance and etc. I would argue that shouldn't keep us off, at least, then to work with the data and try to get a grip on the on the understanding of the situation. So in the case of Haiti, I would hope that the assessments were still used for our own understanding, for our own programming, even though it got blocked kind of at this sort of public sort of communicating all those findings. And yes, we are sometimes maybe in a little bit gray sphere, but that case might argue it's sometimes better to get our wrists slapped and ask for permission, at least for our own understanding, and maybe being careful then how we then communicate this public before we launch a public report, etc. Peter, what do you also experience with these kind of situations?
Yeah. There's one way is the official way, and then there is of course sort of the different avenues that you can take to get a certain message across at different levels of government with different departments. So again, it comes in a bit back to what do you want to get out of it? What is your objective with that analysis? And find ways in a diplomatic way, sort of political savvy way to get around it. But that, of course, is always one of the main challenges. It's finding a balance, whether it's how to deal with analysis or how to get a certain message across. Working with a very diverse set of partners in the field, whether it's government or UN or others. I think it's also analysis is also an ongoing process. So I think we should try to avoid to get stuck on like a product that is not being released and focus on the ongoing analysis that needs to take place in a changing environment.
A good example are always the figures, right? Figures of affected, people in need. As soon as you put that in an official plan, it becomes political. But that still shouldn't hamper us to come down after 2 coordination meetings, stick it in a PowerPoint, or whatever sort of semi-formal way there is to get this information out and get people to think about it. I think that's the balance we'll have to always negotiate in every operation. That'll be slightly different.
Yeah.
Probably not the most satisfying answer, but I hope still it helps.
Good question. I hope the answer was satisfying. We have to leave it here. We are an hour in, and so we have a limit. But if you want to ask some more questions, we will post this on the UNDAC Facebook page. So in the next day or hours. So if you have any additional questions, post it on the Facebook page, and we'll reply there, or Marcus will reply there, and maybe we'll help it. So
I don't leave next week.
Well, yeah, but like John Marinos, he'll work a bit on this important subject during his holidays. So again, we have been today, the first of the UNDAC talks. We've been talking to Marcus Elten about that crowded environment and in data and response with many respondents. The next UNDAC talk will be on the 10th of August. And so to know exactly which topic that will be, we'll post it also on the UNDAC Facebook page. So stay tuned, and this recording will also go on Facebook. Thanks very much again for your time. Thanks, Marcus, again. Marcus, thanks. Great preview, and looking forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much.
Turn this off. We're out.
Yeah.
Oh,
We're still recording.
Yeah, but we're not.